So today we are going to be talking about the feudal system. We're going to look at a few different things, and you'll have some questions that you can answer. Pause the recording if you need to pause the recording to answer the questions. Answer them at the end, up to you. Okay, so today our goals for the lesson are we are going to be looking at important terms that are associated with feudalism. We're going to explain the factors that led to the rise of feudalism in Europe. We're going to identify the different roles within feudalism, so kings, lords, knights, and serfs. And we're going to just evaluate the feudal system, how it worked. Okay, so feudalism, starting off. Feudalism is the political and social system based on granting land in exchange for loyalty, military assistance, and other services. Basically, feudalism was both the government system, okay, it decided who was in charge, and it was the social system. So it basically put everyone in society into a different group, and you knew what group you were in, you were born into that group, and that's pretty much the group you stayed in, okay? It's the way of organising society this way is into a hierarchy, okay? A hierarchy of importance. Obviously, the king at the top has more power than the nobles underneath and the knights underneath them, and the least powerful group of all were the peasants. It worked on a system of exchange, like we talked about. So one group would exchange services to the group above them. For example, the peasants could exchange farming so that the knights would protect them. Okay, so that's how the system worked. So how did the feudalism come into being? So as we know, during the end of the ancient period, the end of the Roman Empire, the start of the Middle Ages, barbarian invasions from the north caused the Western Roman Empire to fall. The fall of the Roman Empire, which used to control a large area, as we've looked at, and provide protection for the people who lived in the Roman Empire. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, there were rise of a lot of new kingdoms and states that were not united like the Roman Empire was. These little kingdoms were based around village life, okay? The new kingdoms and villages and towns were unable to protect themselves from the barbarian invasions, which caused the need for a localized protection system. Okay, so this localized protection system that arose was the feudal system. Okay, so like we talked about, groups would exchange services such as farming in order to be protected by knights, noblemen, and kings. Okay. So, just to recap quickly on that, it was developed as a result of frequent invasions from Western Europe, and knights and nobles needed a way to protect their land. So they developed the system of feudalism. An important person in the development of feudalism was Charlemagne, who was a king who controlled a lot of land in Central Europe at the time, and he was a key figure in the development of feudalism. So how feudalism works is basically lords divide their land into estates called fiefs. Okay, so the king would control all of the land. He would divide that up between nobles or vassals, and in return for that land, the nobles would provide services. So fiefs were given to vassals in return for loyalty and military service. So loyalty to the king and military service. So as you can see on our diagram to the right, all nobles were vassals to the kings. So the kings owned all the land, would give land to nobles, who would in turn give land to knights, who would in turn let peasants farm the land for them in exchange for protection and small amounts of food from the land. So if we break the feudal system pyramid down, at the bottom we have serfs and freemen. Up above those were the lesser nobles, so knights and some clergy. Clergy are people associated with the church. The church in medieval Europe had a lot of power, so those associated with the church, lesser clergy were at this level, And you can see there that the serfs exchanged labour in order to get protection, labour being farming and things like that. The next level up, we have powerful nobles who would grant land and protection to those underneath in order to get back loyalty and military service. So the knights would fight in wartime for the powerful nobles. Similar again, above the powerful nobles, we have the king who controls all the land. He distributes the land to powerful nobles in return for loyalty and service in times of invasion and things like that. So that's the structure of the feudal system. You can see that everyone has a place within the feudal system and everyone has a role within the feudal system, both a role to those above them and those below them. So let's have a look at the different roles in the feudal system. So a knight. What is a knight? So almost all nobles were knights. That's important, okay? Training began at the age of 7 as a page, so under the guidance of the lady of the manor. They became squires at the age of 15 and were trained by other knights to become a knight, and those deemed worthy were dubbed knights. Okay, so it was almost like an apprenticeship. So knights were mounted warriors who protected the lord's land from invasion and also went to fight for their lords. They were given land in exchange for their services, and they lived under what was known as the Code of Chivalry. This was a code of ethics that was followed by all knights. Okay, and part of that code of ethics or chivalry were things like honesty, fairness in battle, loyalty, and proper treatment of women. And here's a nice image of being a knight in feudal times. So you can see up there we have a nice description of chivalry and a few other things. So pause that, have a look at that, and we'll move on. So there are obviously, as we've talked about, obligations for each of the groups. Okay, so it wasn't simply that serfs were just treated badly and had to work the land. There were obligations. So knights had obligations to their lord, so they provided military service, they remained loyal and faithful, they gave money on special occasions, and the lord's obligations to the knights were that they gave the knights land in return for their military service. They helped protect from attack. Okay, so they got their knights together to help protect from attack and resolve disputes between knights. Okay, a different group, obviously, that we've looked at are the peasants and the serfs. Okay, so serfs are basically peasants who lived and worked on the lord's land. Okay, so they lived there underneath the landlord. They would work the land for the lord. They were not allowed to leave the manor or marry without the lord's permission. So they were, in effect, slaves to the landlord. They were allowed to farm on the manor in return for work. So they would farm large bits of land for the lord, provide food, they would get a little bit of food in return. Okay? However, lords were required to protect their serfs. So if there was an invasion, it was the obligation of the lords to protect their serfs. The life of a serf was very hard. It was very harsh. They worked very long hours, and very few lived past the age of 35. It was based on hereditary. It was based on a system that if you were a serf, your kids would be a serf, or if your parents were serfs, you would be a serf. There was very little movement in social classes. So peasants had to pay taxes to use the mill and the bakery, and they had to pay what was called a tithe or to the priest, or it was a religious tax, so a church tax. Serfs lived in crowded cottages with dirt floors and straw beds, so life was very difficult. And like I said, they worked very long hours raising crops, livestock, feeding and clothing their family, and they lived on a poor diet. Illness, malnutrition were common, and that life expectancy was rarely above 35. Another important point is that during medieval times, in the Middle Ages, 90% of the population were serfs or peasants. So it was a huge chunk of the population were serfs and peasants. Okay, so that was the way it worked. It was a very good system, feudalism, in keeping control of 90% of the population. They had to work hard, they had to pay their taxes in order to be able to live on the land. So it was a very good system in controlling the majority of the population, while those above the peasants were able to live much more luxurious and lives that weren't as difficult. Sometimes there were what you would call a peasant uprising or a peasant revolt, where peasants would try to rise up and take over. However, they were very poorly trained, very unhealthy, and never had the weapons capable of being able to take over from the lord of the manor. So that's why it rarely worked out. And that's it. There's some questions there. So please answer those as well. Thank you.